To take home the Golden Gloves, you've got to put in the work, and you've got to be tough as nails. Ashley Kalis was driven to achieve. Today, Kalis is still fueled by that same hope, grit, and determination. A mother of 3 school-aged boys and successful business owner who ran testing and vaccination sites across the state. Kalis is the fighter Rhode Island needs right now because it's time for a change. Ashley Kalis for governor.
Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman. I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Dr. Jason J. Smart. He is a specialist in character assassination and also in Russia, Ukraine, and the post-Soviet world. He's been a political advisor for 2 political parties in the US and to various actors in Russia and Ukraine. We'll talk more about it in a few minutes. And our topic today is counterintelligence. Recently, a huge article by Reuters shed some light on the mysterious political purges going on in Ukraine, which are tied to a long investigation into Russia's efforts to infiltrate the country and to bring it down from within even before the war started. We'll discuss more what's going on. Dr. Smart, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get into the topic, I'd like to ask you a few questions about yourself by way of introducing you to our audience. Your bio states that you got thrown out from Russia all the way back in 2010 for advising Russian opposition to Putin. How did you end up there to begin with? Who were you working with, and how did this set of circumstances arise?
So it's a very legitimate question, and thank you for inviting me today. It's great to see you. So I was in 2009 actually hired to work with a program sponsored by the US government to work with the opposition, democratic opposition in Russia. And so in that epoch, if you might recall, already a long time ago, 13 years ago, Boris Nemtsov was leading, well, it was the top leader, I would argue, of the opposition. And so I was invited to go work with the programming done to support him and support other democratic actors. And while I was awaiting my visa, I got a letter from the Immigration Service, which, as you recall, is underneath the security service of Russia in the Soviet period, was under the KGB. And it stated very simply that per Article 27.1 of the Immigration Code of the Russian Federation, which reads that people who are a threat to the security of the Russian state shall not be able to enter the country. And it's interesting is that that specific statute, once they've identified you as being a threat to the security of the Russian state, you can no longer appeal it. There's no appeal process. So you are for life banned from entering Russia. And so I was at a very young age banned from entering Russia for life. And shortly thereafter, of course, I was banned from Belarus because they have a common security pact. And if you're banned in one country, banned in the other country. And so since that time, I've continued to work with the Russian opposition. When I was in college, I wrote about the Russian opposition, an undergraduate degree, and the different movements that were there and the influence they had in local politics and national politics. And this was towards the beginning of the Putin era. Well, not the beginning, he'd already been in office for 8-9 years. But I was in college. I guess he'd only been there like 5 or 6 years. But I was helping investigate this, to write about this academically as well. And so I've been tied to the opposition in Russia for, gosh, almost 20 years.
Ultimately, Nemtsov ended up being assassinated, and in light of that, your expulsion prior to his, demise seems particularly ominous. Were you the only person who was expelled, or were there other people in that program who were working, who were basically mass banned at that time?
No, actually, I was the only one who got thrown out. Though I got lucky on that, because the guy who preceded me flew to Moscow, the American, and he was there, I think, the same day he arrived. They invited him out to dinner, his colleagues, and when they were leaving the restaurant, a group of skinheads pulled him off the sidewalk and started kicking him, beating him. And the next morning, he got a notification that his application for a work visa would not be reviewed, and they had to leave the country in 24 hours. So I guess I got a lot luckier than that guy.
That's for sure. And this is just one episode showing that Russia, far from ever being a democracy, had these authoritarian leanings even as early as that time. And that was just a precursor for some of the things we are seeing today. For those who are under any illusions that Russia is in any sort of a wonderful conservative Christian paradise, this employment of skinheads to carry out state functions, points to exactly the opposite, actually. So curiously, you later on ended up in Ukraine working on anti-corruption initiatives, but you were working with the state security services. How did that end up happening?
Well, I mean, after I got thrown out of Russia, I spent 4 years in Kyrgyzstan. And I worked with the government there after the revolution in 2010. I helped them write the national constitution, other reforms that went on while I was there. And after that finished, I actually went to Moldova, and I worked with who is now the current president, included Maya Sandu. And I worked with her political party, or the party she was part of in that period of time. And I got to work with a lot of the leadership, and it was a fascinating period of time. She was then the Minister of Education. This is 2013 or 14, I guess. And then afterwards, in 2015, I moved to Kiev, and I was offered to begin working with a guy who, he headed the security service of Ukraine. After leaving the security service of Ukraine, he continued this anti-corruption work that he'd started as the director of the SBU, as it's called in Russian or Ukrainian, and actually Ukrainian, not Russian. So he invited me to help him with that, and I helped him create this national movement, which I continued working with him from 2015, I guess, until 2019, 2020-ish. And it was actually just about then that, simply due to work reasons, I went to another project.
So interestingly enough, and this is important for our conversation as part of a setup for the conversation, since 2014, Russia's annexation of Crimea, the events surrounding the departure of Yanukovych from the country, there's been sort of a taboo almost on discussing Russia's influence in Ukraine and the Russian influence over political parties and the way that influence impacted the level of corruption in the country. Could you comment on that? Because there seems to be a lot of confusion surrounding the Biden-Trump connections to various assorted parties and the changes in government and so forth.
Mm-hmm. No, it is a fascinating topic. And the fact that Ukraine has come up so much in the past 8 years is surprising even to myself. Following the invasion, there's obviously been a number of scandals, whether it was Biden's ties to Ukraine, specifically his son's ties to an energy company there that has very strong Russian ties, where there was the allegations, obviously, that as the vice president of the United States, he was pushing reforms in Ukraine that would economically benefit his son's interest. And thereafter, as you recall, the first impeachment of Trump related to pressure that he had apparently given to President Zelensky to turn over information about Biden's dealings in Ukraine. So twice, Ukraine has managed to be a top news story in the US for domestic reasons, which is strange. Usually it's interesting. What happens in foreign countries is only interesting to Americans in an isolated context. But for Ukraine to come up so many times in a few years is quite uncommon. So, and then obviously the invasion 6 months ago, 5 months ago, is something that has dominated headlines around the world and continues to. So I think that Ukrainians can continue being in the news. But Russia has definitely used this as an opportunity for themselves. They definitely have viewed what has gone on in Ukraine as something that they can manipulate for their own self-interest. And they have. I mean, Russia is, they're not dumb. They're very smart. And that they have a very good sense of, I would say, political opportunism. When they see something that pops up that might be able to help them change a narrative or push a narrative, they do it. And if we see that in terms of the disinformation, for instance, leading up to the war, whether it's they find little niches, the biolabs, for instance, which they talk about, or the fascist regime in Kiev, and all these different things that or what is it, the massacre, or what do they call it? Yes, the massacre of the people in Donbass, which is just false. So when we look at all this, Russians have a very strong sense of trying to find little things to latch onto and narratives to push, which they do find, and they try to exploit for their domestic purposes.
Well, Ukraine is a fine example of illustrating that the Cold War never really ended. Russia continued its interest in asserting influence in post-Soviet republics after the Soviet Union's fell apart. People stopped paying attention, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. And this is the level of influence that brings us to the events we are seeing today. I'll get to Russian disinformation and its relative impact or lack of thereof in a little bit, and we'll discuss some of your specialization and character assassination with regards to that. But right now, I wanted to ask you the following. This major investigation by Reuters and among a host of other sources in recent days points to the fact that the preparation for some sort of a change of regime, change of government in Ukraine by Russia was in the works for long before the actual military tactics had become publicly observable. I wanted to ask you about an item that caught my eyes in November of last year that was not widely reported at all. I posted about it on Twitter before I was banned from it, which is that the Ukrainian security services reported an attempted coup that was thwarted in November. It didn't say, they didn't report who the coup was tied in, whether it was by pro-Russian oligarchs, whether it was by a foreign actor. There were no details other than there was this attempted effort. Do you know anything about it? And is that the effort that the Reuters articles points to as one of the Russia's operations that were supposed to peacefully change the government and install one of their puppets?
So that's a good question. So I do clearly remember that. I was in Kiev when that all happened. And so it is interesting. So it is a very controversial topic, to be frank. The security service said, yes, that there is a plot to get rid of Zelensky. Now, part of the problem with the plot, the alleged plot, is that it named essentially, well, most of the biggest names in television media in the country as being part of the plot. Dmitry Gordon, Savik Schuster, and others. And as a result of this, there was accusations that perhaps this was something to try to silence people who are critical of his regime. And this was being used as a means to silence them. Shortly thereafter, as you recall, they introduced the law that closed down the TV station that some of these people worked with. There is probably some room to believe that might be the case. However, I will say, as much as I do admire those two journalists and many of the others, I do think that there was a sharp increase in the amount of criticism of Zelensky, which would, to me, seem very strange that just sort of naturally popped up, that was not somehow coordinated. That being said, the TV stations, as you know, are owned by oligarchs, Ukrainian oligarchs. Pro-Russian, I mean, strictly pro-Russian ones like Medvedchuk have not owned TV stations in Ukraine for a couple of years. Medvedchuk famously, as you know, his daughter's godfather is Vladimir Putin. No, he hasn't owned a TV station for a couple of years in Ukraine. But the other oligarchs are all guys who are self-interested. And in the history of Ukraine, the role of the oligarchy is hard to look past. I mean, let's be frank, it's dominated things. All the revolutions that Ukraine has had, the hand of the oligarchy has also been tied to that. They were not things that were just spontaneous. The way that the news covered them, how the news covered them, how the news encouraged people to come to protest. This is something that was a deliberate decision to support a movement or to not support a movement. But neither here nor there. Going back to November, it would seem to me, and I do not know this, but it would seem to me, because I was there and I was following the news carefully, that there was probably an opportunistic desire on part of the government to try to get rid of some of the people who are most critical of the government. I do not think it was tied to Russia, or at least I've never seen any evidence thereof. The government has frequently, and this goes back to Poroshenko did the same thing, the president before Zelensky, is to just simply say something is pro-Russian or something is a Russian agent or something is a Russian plot without proving that in any way. I mean, it's very easy to just say that, and people then are discredited because of being accused of being a Russian agent. But unless it's proved, I think that that's a very weak threshold. And so that was an interesting period. But since then, and I think this probably says the most about whether or not that was truly a plot, some of the top names from that period of time that are part of this alleged plot are currently on TV, and there's no problem. So, I mean, if it had really been involved in some sort of conspiracy, it's strange to me that the government never prosecuted a single person.
So prior to these events, the first 2 years of Zelensky's tenure were basically COVID. The country was closed, a lot of things were canceled. At the same time, he came into the government on the platform of fighting corruption, fighting, the control by oligarchs, and he also had a lot of turnover inside his political surroundings, inside the cabinet. The level of political support for him prior to the start of the war was relatively low. How do we explain that? Was he not successful? Was he in fighting in the platforms? Was it COVID that played the role? What was going on? What was this political context before this attempted coup?
And I like that question a lot because it's unfortunate. It's the way history is, though. People usually only remember, this brief moment. I doubt very many Americans, for instance, knew who Zelensky was before the war. Maybe they heard about the comedian that got elected president, but I don't think they'd remember much else. The fact is, as somebody who was living there at the time, and as you know, I go a lot on Ukrainian TV. I mean, like a lot, and so several times a week. And as a result, going on these political talk shows and discussing with Ukrainians what's going on, I feel that I have a pretty good vibe of what's happening and what people are saying. And the view of Zelensky was that he was elected, as you recall, because Poroshenko had been a huge disappointment. Poroshenko had come on the heels of the Maidan revolution that ousted the pro-government Yanukovych government, the pro-Russian Yanukovych government, sorry. And as a result, there was huge hopes that he would turn the country towards Europe and make huge reforms. And in fact, there was just a huge amount of corruption and a lot of problems. And people had extremely low opinion of him. I think when he left office, Poroshenko had something like an 8% approval rating, 9% approval rating. So when he was in the second round of elections against Zelensky, Zelensky won 76% of the vote, if I recall correctly. 76% of the vote is pretty amazing. So he won by a landslide. Once again, huge optimism, huge hopes that he was going to completely change the country, reform the country, and do everything differently. And those hopes were met with a great degree of disappointment as the economy didn't make any huge changes. There was also a lot of allegations of corruption within his cabinet. And there was a lot of ongoing problems. And this feud with the media, for instance, that was not helping him. And so you're right before the invasion, his support level was about 26%. To give you an idea of how that is, so he was declining at one of the fastest rates for a Ukrainian president to lose popularity. If we looked at the trend, because when you look at polling, one of the most important features is to look at the tendency, the trend, which way is it going, right? And the rate that he was declining, which was pretty steady, pretty quick, he would have probably by this point been down to 10% or something. So he was really quite unpopular. Now, obviously, when there's something like a war, the rally around the flag effect comes into place, and it does completely change the way that people think about someone. You want a good example of that? Remember George W. Bush when he got elected? There was a huge divide in the country as to whether or not he stole the election in Florida and all these other things, hanging chads, and this era. But once September 11th came around, which was only 9 months after he became president, what happened? We saw a approval rating of, if I recall correctly, 93%, which is amazing. But that's not necessarily that people love him. I remember he couldn't even walk on his own inauguration, Bush, because there's so many people yelling and trying to throw things at him, and the Secret Service worried about security. But it's the same thing here, is people forget all of that very quickly when there's an external threat that arrives on the scene, such as September 11th, or in the case of Ukraine, February 24th, when the Russians invaded the country.
To what extent would you say the issues that faced Zelensky before the war were really a matter of his own decision-making problems, and to what extent were they entrenched issues that could not genuinely be resolved overnight, and that optimism was, quite frankly, misplaced, not because of him, but because it was beyond anyone's power to single-handedly turn the country around in 2 years?
I mean, obviously, there's things like recession that came because of COVID, which is something that's outside his control. And so I think that, leaders who were unfortunate enough to be in power during that time usually didn't work out very well for them. Now, that being said, a lot of the criticisms around him specifically were different in nature. That it was specifically that he was hiring people for jobs for which they're not qualified. And the one that was the most stunning, and we just saw the end of this game last week, was the director of the SBU. As a good example of that. The director of the SBU has been a friend of his since he was in his 20s, helped him to organize his stand-up comedy routines and stuff when he was a very young guy and living in Eastern Ukraine. And the guy had no qualification to be director of the SBU. I mean, he's a television, or not even television, show man sort of thing, organizing comedy routines. And he was directing the Security Service Ukraine. And that's why the Security Service Ukraine last week, when Zelensky did have him fired and the parliament voted to remove him as director of the SBU, which was a good decision, it was pretty stunning to see what had come out. Politico had an excellent article, 2 articles about it actually, talking about the number of generals who are thought to have been giving information to the Russians, the number of officers, senior officers, who were apparently texting over positions of Ukrainian defense in the early morning hours of February 24th. It's treason. I mean, it's literally treason. Some that have been arrested with tons of money, gems and other things, having fled the country right after the war began. These are just terrible. And so this man who was heading SBU, their friend Zelensky, was the one responsible for cleaning that place up to prevent from something like this happening. And obviously that did not happen.
So obviously the wrong man in the wrong place meets Russia's intent to create a problem of some sort on some level, and the fact that there are already forces in place who are in general opposed to whatever Zelensky did have in mind and have their own agenda and their own position regardless of whatever he was trying to do. You have this combination of factors creating the perfect storm for for the exploitation of this unhealthy relationship between Ukraine and Russia's intelligence that goes back to the early post-Soviet era. There is this sense that Russia never had fully let go of its imperial ambitions. That this combination of glory days of World War I plus the Soviet level spheres of influence, and we have seen that level of meddling all over. From Azerbaijan and South Caucasus, the rest of South Caucasus, to the Baltics, to the Central Asia, of course, Belarus, and even some parts of Eastern Europe. To what extent was Ukraine's positioning in that regard any worse or better than any of those other countries, would you say?
That's a really good question. So I think there was some benefits that they had. One benefit that Ukraine had was the experience of other countries. Seeing how that had played out there. Also, there was significant efforts to begin really de-Sovietizing the country. And I don't mean in the symbolic way, which they also did, which is taking down hammers and sickles and things like this, but I mean in a much more serious structural ways. And I look at the security service as an example, the military is another good example, where you saw an intentional effort to start phasing out the older generation that was trained in the Soviet Union. Obviously, some still remain, but I think a great deal of the ones who were senior leaderships before, they had a very, and it's not necessarily that they were not loyal, it's just they had the wrong mentality. I mean, if you want to be a flexible military and be a flexible security service, not like the KGB, but like the FBI, then you have to change the way that you operate. And in the case of Ukraine, since 2014, when the war first began, the Americans worked very closely with the Ukrainians, and that's no secret. I mean, everyone knows that, and to help them make these reforms. And as a result of that, I mean, they had 8 years since then, before this most recent invasion began, to really make a lot of impact. I mean, you consider how much 8 years is. And we think about it in the context of America, where the average public career is 20 years. That's a significant amount. In 8 years would be 40% of your professional life. So if you were in there, let's imagine day one, you're already 40% through your career. You're already a mid-level officer. You probably already have some significant responsibility. And that's why having this new generation who's got a different worldview, has more appreciation of a better way of doing things, is there now. And we see the benefits of it. Actually, one of the criticisms I've seen the most of the way that Ukraine is executing the war in Eastern Ukraine is not of Ukraine necessarily. It's actually more of the leadership in the military, where a lot of younger officers have complained that the more senior officers, not all of them, some of them specifically, have too much of a closed mind where they just say, no, but that's the way we've always done it. And they don't want to open up. I've seen that criticism a number of times, so it makes me believe it probably really does continue to be a problem. And once again, Rome was not built in a day. I didn't expect this to be quick. But at the same time, at least the country began to take some of the serious steps to reform that some other places had not done.
We're seeing this effort to modernize the military, to modernize the security services, to cut ties with the collaboration with Russia that has allowed Russia to penetrate these structures. And even without the wrong choice for the head of SBU, that was an ongoing problem on various levels. Besides these obvious structures, who was the target for Russia's infiltration exactly? And why, what made it so successful?
Within Ukraine.
Yes.
So I think that it's an important thing to understand about Russia, and it's a very worthwhile topic, is that Russia, the way it operates as a country, isn't necessarily so direct and black and white, where they come to you and they say, you know, we want you to cooperate with us, here's money. It's usually not like that. I mean, once again, they're not dumb. They're pretty smart. And they got lots of experience doing this. And they've got a lot of different instruments that they can use. And I think one of the favorites, you've probably seen a country like Ukraine, is that a Russian will never approach you. I mean, even if it was a Russian, you probably wouldn't know it. You might assume it's Ukrainian. But let's imagine that they don't want to even send a Russian. They want to send somebody else. There is plenty of opportunities to send, let's imagine, an Iranian businessman who offers to do business with you, who offers you money to do something. Now, in your mind, Iran doesn't have the same reputation in Ukraine that it does in the United States. It doesn't necessarily set off alarm bells immediately. It's just a normal country, more or less. And so as a result, there is less of a fear factor. I mean, if somebody came and said they're from Moscow, people go crazy and they become paranoid. But if they say they're from Tehran, it doesn't strike the same fear. And so they can use proxies such as Iran to seek Russian interest in the country. And you think, you know, you're a mid-level professional or bureaucrat, and you believe that you're doing favors for an Iranian businessman. Little do you know that, in fact, you're serving Russian interests through your actions.
To what extent do you think this use of proxies that has not really been hinted at by some of these articles that came out, they focused more on the Russian-Ukrainian cultural factor and the great deal of exchanges and common business and other ties that have existed before all of this as an impact for this penetration. To what extent do you think these foreign proxies played and continue to play a role in this process, and especially in After the downing of the Ukrainian airplane by Iran, which caused a political rift between them, do you think Iran continued wanting to play that role for Russia? What was in it for them from that perspective?
I think that there's usually something that one country needs and the other one wants. It's hard to say what it might be. It could be something completely unrelated to Ukraine. It could be a mutual interest in selling parts to be used for missiles. It could be anything. It could be literally limitless. It could be getting votes in the United Nations to do something. I mean, it could be anything in the world. So it's hard to predict where their secret collaboration might be. That being said, you're absolutely right. There has always historically been a close relationship to Russia. I mean, even the military, most certainly the Navy in Ukraine was famous for its very close relationship to Russia. I mean, you saw that the Ukrainian Navy today is well, it exists, doesn't have any boats, but it exists. And the reason is that in 2014, as you recall, the Ukrainian Navy capitulated to Russia. I mean, very quickly. And most of it, almost all of it, not all of it, but a lot of it. And in the case of this most recent war, the degree that the Ukrainian Navy surrendered all the ships was pretty stunningly fast. And why did that happen? Well, I do imagine there was very strong ties. I mean, there was very strong historic ties. So that is absolutely the case. In the case of why, it's a factor of how close Ukraine and Russia are historically. Obviously, I mean, I know it's very not politically correct today in Ukraine to say that they're very close, but they are. I mean, historically they are. I mean, they were historically the same country for essentially the whole history. And so when we look at that linguistically, religiously, culturally, and historic enemies, historic alliances, the countries have had a lot in common. Intermarriage between the two is incredibly high. You look at the number, I bet if you pulled up a name of Putin's cabinet today and you look at the last names, you identify a lot as being ethnic Ukrainians. If you look at, in the case of Ukraine, look at the number of people that have ethnic Russian last names. So there's quite a bit of spreading back and forth. So I think that's part of the reason that there was such a huge shock when Russia decided to invade in 2014. And, one of my friends actually makes this reference a lot, and I think it's the best example. He said, it wasn't just being attacked. It was that, your friend, your neighbor, your brother comes and attacks you. It's just so out of the blue. It's how would they do this to us? I mean, we're so close for so long and you do this to us. And there was an offensive nature to this. This was not simply an attack from a rogue actor. This was not Al-Qaeda. This was a country that they all knew well, all of them. And it's obviously, I know today everybody will say, no, I've always hated Russia. But statistically, I can tell you that's not the case. I mean, polling in Ukraine in 2013 showed that it was, if I recall correctly, 58% of people had a positive opinion of Putin. So, I mean, no, to imagine that this was a country that hated Russia, historically it wasn't. That's changed, obviously, because now they've seen Russia for what it is, and specifically Putin, the war criminal, is for whom he is. But the fact is that Russia's always had that opportunity for generations due to the close collaboration to be able to, between the two countries, to be able to get its hand in things such as the military or into state secrets of Ukraine.
The recent investigations into Russia's intelligence efforts in Ukraine, their attempts to recruit backers, point to the fact that initially the plan was for a peaceful internal coup or some sort of a collaborationist effort to get Zelensky out of power, to force them to flee, and the plan was not to enter the war. Nevertheless, we saw military preparations ongoing for months prior to the action being taken. And there seems to be a contradiction between two. A coup, it seems to be something hidden, quiet, political, not involving massive accumulation of military and a threat, and which gives fair warning to the target that to prepare and to figure out a plan. What exactly was what am I missing here? Why is there's a point to a hidden plot, but we've seen evidence of open aggression being worked out?
I think that there was always a plan for aggression. I mean, and that's very clear. I mean, Putin had no means really to gain the territories he wanted to gain, the same ones he's wanted since 2014, if it was not for that. And so I think that there was undoubtedly going to be an invasion. And it's, by the way, what American intelligence had said since the beginning. You remember back in 2021 already, the CIA director flew to Moscow to meet the Russians and to explain that we knew that they were planning this. So the American government was quite sure that there was going to be this. Now, internally, was there also a plot to somehow get rid of Zelensky? You know, I obviously I don't know what the Americans know, and I don't know what the Russians know that they were planning to do. But based upon what we've seen publicly, it would seem that yes, they probably were collaborating with various people to get rid of Zelensky. How that would be done, I don't know, but I'm sure that they were plotting some sort of way to get rid of him. One of the things that's important in the case of Ukrainian politics and less Russian politics, but definitely in Ukrainian politics, is the role of the oligarchs. And the reason I wish to stress this one more time is that it's for intelligence purposes. I think it's also worth mentioning. So this year, it's projected that the GDP of Ukraine should drop by 50% due to the war. Though some estimates is that it's been a lot more, but let's imagine it's 50%. It means our GDP is less than 75 billion, which is less than Napa Valley, California. So when you have a GDP of less than Napa Valley, California, and you have a yearly budget of, if I recall correctly, 35 billion, 34 billion, something like this, for the country. And you have oligarchs that are worth, let's say, 10 billion, 15 billion more. Nobody really knows how much they have. Let's imagine tens of billions of dollars, collectively, much more than the budget of the country or GDP of the country, collectively. How much control do they have? They have incredible control, incredible power. I mean, for them to build their own private security services, let's imagine, informal, let's call it, their own spies, their own people, their own network of people who are bribed in every different ministry and every different government is very real. I mean, it's don't have any doubt. I have no doubt whatsoever that they do it, 100% sure. And Thomas Jefferson had a quote, which I always use an example when I'm speaking about the oligarchs, which is Jefferson said that a businessman, a commerçant, has no nationality. He serves his own interests. And I think that's a really good example. I don't think the oligarchs necessarily are against Ukraine, but I think that they ultimately have their own interest at heart in everything that they're doing. I mean, it's not good for the state that they bribe people, but we know that they do it. And so as a result of the fact that they are sort of abusing the entire society for their own economic gain, I think that does serve Russia's interest, one. How Russia might manipulate that or use that, because they also have financial interest, I have no doubt, in Russia, and how that might be manipulated or blackmailed, perhaps even, is a really legitimate, interesting question for me. And I think that there's a reason to believe that if Russia wished to do something serious and large scale inside of Ukraine, it would probably use not some person in the presidential administration. They would use the oligarchs to leverage change in the country.
We're seeing some very interesting public information that seems to, again, on the surface, be almost contradictory, but I'm curious. And that's about the level of Ukraine's preparation or readiness for a re-invasion or additional expansion of Russia's invasion. It's been occupying Crimea and it's been meddling in Donetsk and Luhansk for years, so that's nothing new. But this additional expansion of operations, to what extent they were ready? The articles point to some of the claim that Russia's intelligence efforts, Russia's effort to build the spy network failed to some extent because many of these spies were unreliable, and because, as we have seen, ultimately Zelensky got wind of what was going on and didn't go anywhere, and there were also public warnings from the US and so forth. And we've seen that Ukraine had approached the Biden administration, among other countries, for weapons for at least a year before these events, when a year or more in cases of other countries. So to some extent, Ukraine must have had its own counterintelligence effort to get information about Russia's long-term plans. How aware were they of these plots and invasions?
So it's a good question. And once again, I only know what I saw. And so and what I've read and talking to others, my sense, very strong sense, would be that the Ukrainians as a whole, not just Zelensky, the Ukrainians as a whole, believe that the Americans were far overstating the case about the potential for invasion. There was certainly a sense that the Americans were overblowing it. Zelensky said multiple times before the actual invasion, as you recall, that the biggest thing that we need, don't worry about invasion, worry about panic. We should not have panic. There are some people, myself included, though in my opinion doesn't matter these things, but I said in TV interviews in Ukraine that the government should have evacuated people from the cities that are closest to or most likely to be invaded. That was never done, obviously. And it's unfortunate because I'm sure a lot of lives were lost because of this lack of preparation. That being said, I think that Zelensky and team were certainly listening to other people such as Europeans specifically. When I say Europeans, I would like to cite the Germans once again. The Germans, head of the security service of Germany, whose name escapes me, but the head of the security service of Germany was in Kiev on February 24th when the invasion began, as you recall. And because he was so certain that nothing was going to happen, by the way. And so he was there for urgent meetings to relay information, and the invasion began. And by the way, it began exactly as the Americans had said it would. But either way, he was there and he had to flee the country. I think it took 2 days or a day and a half by car to get to Western Ukraine, then escape across the border to Poland, from which he then got to Germany. But this shows like the difference. The Germans were, this is the head of the security service of Germany saying nothing's going to happen. So, I mean, if you're having multiple parties here, some saying that it's going to happen, the Americans, the Brits, and some saying nothing's going to happen. Look at, and you can easily look it up, which is a convenient part about the news today online, is that we can look at all the statements of the Ukrainian government back then. When the American embassy closed down, the Brits closed their embassy, the Italians closed their embassy. Huge criticisms that they were scaremongering, that they were hurting the investment climate of Ukraine. And the Americans said there's going to be an invasion, and it was completely rejected. And to the degree that it was rejected by common people, I cannot emphasize enough. I mean, I do not recall a single friend, and I mean sincerely, I'm talking dozens and dozens of people I spoke to in probably a week and a half before it started. Not one thought there would be an invasion. And this includes members of parliament, this includes people in the security service, this includes you name it. I mean, I was speaking to a group of students of international relations, of all things, 10 hours before there was the invasion. And I said, you know, I'm very concerned. I think it's going to happen any moment. And they all, I'm trying to remember, I don't think one out of 76 students, 86 students, not one thought there was going to be an invasion.
So in terms of the popular opinion, you know, people go by what they hear, they make their own conclusions. Sometimes there is confirmation bias, some wishful thinking, and so forth. When it comes to governments, intelligence services, there is evidence or there is lack of evidence. Was clearly both parties presented some sort of both sides pushing for, you know, the US and the Europeans had to have presented some internal communications by the Russians, some level of preparation, some documentation, not to mention signals intelligence of moving into position, cost benefits of running, you know, a fake out versus, you know, a diversion versus a real full-on preparation for a real full-on invasion, and political deliberations. Biden was refusing to take any action that would have prevented any sort of action, and he was very public about this invasion, but at the same time not doing anything about it, which kind of undermined the case. To what extent was there any evidence presented by anybody versus completely rhetorical push that could have been reasonably interpreted either way?
No, I mean, we don't know what was provided, but we know that it was substantial. The Americans did provide intelligence to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians chose not to consider it for whatever reason. They did in the end. I mean, I do want to point out in the last few days before it happened, it's very clear that there was all of a sudden a panicked, quick move to try to get things ready as in short order as possible. Unfortunately, had they begun planning, you know, weeks or months in advance, I think things would have been a lot better for them. Neither here nor there. It's past now. Most importantly is that I think the biggest pusher, and you know, I this will be controversial, but I really do believe it. Whoever pushed the narrative in Ukraine of "don't worry, nothing's going to happen," that was probably the greatest Russian disinformation thing I've ever seen in my life. And I cannot imagine a single thing that you could have said that would have been better for Russia's interest than that. The lack of preparation. People were not storing water. People were not buying. I mean, I remember with even friends saying, "Why don't you buy water?" No, I'm not going to. Nothing's going to happen. It's just a complete lack of so certain. They said, "No, the government's telling us everything's fine." And you have an entire population that's doing nothing to prepare. It really opens them to serious problems.
I have to say though that this level of, even despite all the appearances, and I've spoken to experts for months prior to the invasion who pointed to the clear lack of a very deliberate intentional preparation for a serious war effort that was very, very costly. And just based on publicly available information, to me it seemed pretty obvious that psychologically, physically, just there had to have been some consideration of for military action far beyond just maneuvering the optics. But there were American sources of information that questioned Biden's approach and questioned U.S. intelligence on the U.S. front. And there were a lot of people in the U.S. who were also saying that because it's Biden, it was not credible. Because of the political circumstances in the US, a lot of people were questioning the output by the US intelligence, and certainly whatever the US intelligence had to say, the way the White House was presenting it. So, not sure what to do in such political scenarios. I'm sure Russia took advantage of that, of course, but that skepticism of this US in my opinion, completely common sense analysis of the events was reached even here, not just Ukraine. And so I don't think this disinformation campaign was just aimed at Zelensky and his surroundings. I do think it was aimed even at the United States.
Sure, I wouldn't discredit it. I mean, I would not say it's not possible. It certainly makes sense to me. And the fact is that Russia, it's such an obvious thing to build up the military. The only thing you can do is how do you prove that it's not going to happen? I think all the signs were there. I think I remember when I saw the CNN headline saying that the Russia had moved its blood banks or taken all the blood reserves possible and moved it to the front. I said, "Oh my God, it's definitely going to happen. It's imminent." You don't move all the blood over there for no reason.
Well, the evidence that could have contradicted that would have been communication at the highest levels leaked or stolen or whatever, obtained somehow, or by the security services, indicating that they do not perceive it as anything other than a Normandy level diversion. But I can't imagine that being the case, especially later on when we found out that even the security services were being deceived and misled to some extent inside Russia, or at least didn't fully know what exactly was happening. But clearly at Putin's level, there was definitely, he would not have communicated that he was not doing something else. He just simply wouldn't communicate about his intentions.
Sure. I mean, I think that with Putin specifically, who knows how we know what the guy is doing or what he's planning.
Mm-hmm.
But that being said, the guy is, Biden said something very interesting, which, I far from do not know what U.S. intelligence capabilities are. But I will say one of the things that the most interesting thing Biden said leading up to the war, which I thought about a lot of times, is that you remember he said in multiple of the press conferences that I don't think Putin has made a decision yet. There's still a chance to back down. And the final press conference, he said, I believe he's already made a decision to invade. And sure enough, the Americans knew it was actually that night that the invasion was supposed to happen. It was then pushed back a day and a half, we now know, or 2 days. It was pushed back specifically because he said that, but as Biden had said that. That had such an impact in Russia. And we know that it's come out now. I mean, you can probably Google it. So that's, I think, fascinating is how did the Americans know that Putin had decided? And how did that reach that down that they would have that sort of information?
You're making a very important point, which I think I don't want the audience to miss, because when you say, and I've read, I've seen these comments by Biden myself, and so did the others, that Putin has not made that decision. That's an interesting comment to make, given the fact that repeatedly U.S. publicly indicated that the invasion was being prepared, and given that Zelensky was either skeptical or at the very least did not want to treat it as something that was avoidable, this was kind of feeding into Zelensky's point. So Biden, at the very least, could be interpreted as having sent mixed messages right up to the point when he did say that it was, that the decision has been made. Why do you think he chose that approach?
It's a good question. It's hard to say. I mean, I think that anyone that knows U.S. intelligence, the way that's typically written is the degree that you can, confidence that it has, and how much can you trust this information? How certain are you of a decision? Because there's things that we think and there's things that we know. And so there's really a big difference. And so I think that, Biden spoke in very sort of, it's actually common, I think, sort of intelligence speak, is that we do not know and we do know. And so he says, here's what we know. The military is built up along these ways. It's done this, blah, blah, blah. But I think, you just say, I know. I think that Putin has still not yet made the final executive decision. Though in the last press conference, he specifically says, I believe that, yes, Putin has made a decision. And that's a very big difference. But also, to me, I have a question. How do we know what Putin knows? And how do we know something that's so different from what the Germans know? And the head of the German intelligence is there, which shows that we're not sharing this with NATO allies, which is also interesting. Granted, it's not one of the Five Eyes countries. Now, if you look at the countries that moved their embassies out the fastest from Kiev before everything went really crap, it were the countries of Five Eyes, which are, as you know, US, Australia, New Zealand, Britain, and Canada. Those countries were the fastest to move their embassies out of Ukraine, which makes me think the Americans were sharing their intelligence with our closest allies.
And which also seems that at the very least, given that it was a coordinated move by 5 countries and not just the US, the other Europeans, the Germans and so forth, had to have known or had to have some level of understanding of the type of intelligence US and others had possessed, and were deliberately possibly engaging in disinformation with Ukraine, as opposed to simply having a different level of information.
No, it's totally possible. It's a legitimate point. I think Germany, as we've seen throughout this entire thing, has been desperate to somehow salvage its relationship with Moscow. And I wonder if it wasn't just purely Germany its interest in what happened in Ukraine was such a far secondary as compared to its interest in maintaining close relations with Moscow, that it was trying, probably, I would imagine, I cannot prove, up until the very end, doing it as much as it could to prevent a war because it realized it would be against its own interest. Has nothing to do with Ukrainian interests, it's against its own interest. And that's why they've dragged their feet this whole time. I mean, look what's happening today. Whether it's the slow giving weapons to Ukraine, the refusal to support things, it's painful. Even leading up to the war, you remember that Germany was unwilling to have weapons shipped to Ukraine via its territory. It promised 5,000 helmets. As far as I know, those helmets still have not arrived to Kiev. Now they've sent other things, though. They have sent, their artillery. But that being said, Germany has always had, in my view, has always had in the back of its head that this too will pass. And when it does pass, how do we get back to good relations with Moscow?
So I want to point something out very interesting. Earlier once the war broke out and once it became obvious that these disinformation efforts continued and Russia's intelligence spy network continued operating, and some of the political actors in Ukraine were obviously helping that effort, eventually Zelensky moved to shut down one of the political parties linked to Russia. He was widely criticized, particularly in the US, by the Tucker Carlson, type of audience for taking undemocratic measures. Now, on the one hand, that party was specifically being described as pro-Russian. On the other hand, for the US, where where political parties accommodate a wide variety of positions, even during moments of altercations, such as the Iran deal, Iran has attacked US targets, but at the same time, you have people who genuinely believing in a diplomatic effort. But let's imagine that the highest echelons of the Democratic Party or Republican Party leaked intelligence information to the country that is a subject of a major political controversy. That's a completely different level from advocating for particular political path and pushing policy. That's an action. That's not just a situation point. That's a whole different level here. And yet this is not what ended up being presented in circles outside Ukraine. What that in itself is a success by Russia's disinformation effort. How did it end up selling this undemocratic point so well in the West, and why did Ukraine, despite its otherwise great information warfare effort, fail in that to counter in that regard?
So it's a really good question. And I think it's a very easy one. So there's actually really two interesting points about understanding Ukraine and what Russia does disinformation. And once again, it's not necessarily always Russia, it could also be oligarchs who have an overlapping interest with Russia. It's not necessarily they're doing it this order of Russia, but they have an interest that might coincide with that of Russia's. And so ultimately it does serve Russian interests, but that's a secondary consequence to what the primary motive is. So in the case of closing political parties, I think we could simply break it down as this. Americans have little to no idea what's going on in Ukraine, especially before the war. And so as soon as a political party gets closed and they see the headline, you could spin that a lot of different ways. And if you have a voice, the bird on your shoulder telling you that this is because it's anti-democratic, which is an easy argument to make. I mean, whenever you close a newspaper, you close a political party, there's the most logical thing that somebody's going to start crying is that it was, repression or anti-democratic. It's a very logical thing. So I think that there is probably interested parties in the United States, including oligarchs from Ukraine, and you'll see where I'm going with this in just a second, who have been trying to push their own games in the United States. That is, they use Congress, the halls of Congress, as another field for them to play Ukrainian games on. So, and I am aware of this, the number of people who go to meet with Congress before the war even, it was frankly, it's insane. I mean, it was literally more than 100 members of parliament from Ukraine every year would go to try to talk to members of Congress. And they really had very little to share with them, but they would waste their opportunity to usually badmouth other members of parliament, who these members of the US Congress had no idea who these people were that they're talking about. And they were really just getting informed by one fraction of the parliament about the other fraction of parliament. And in the end, it hurt Ukraine in the grand scheme of things, because they were trying to play their games and they're trying to get pictures with congressmen because they thought it would make them look very important back in Kiev. But in the end, it hurt Ukraine. So if you're from a political party, let's imagine it's being financed by an oligarch, because they're all financed by oligarchs, and you're financed by an oligarch who has, let's say a newspaper that's being closed, or a factory that's being taken, or a political party they're going to close. How do you deal with this? Well, you go to the United States and you start repeating the message that, oh, look, it's anti-democratic. Look, it's anti-democratic. And your congressmen or your members of parliament who are running around Congress start repeating this. And someone like Tucker Carlson is looking for the chance to jump on Ukraine, to attack Ukraine. And he's a willing party in this, and just give him the excuse and he'll attack Ukraine and support Russia. And so I think that this is a huge part of it. And I think that's actually with Congresswoman Sparks, who the Ukrainians literally in every interview I've had in the last 2 weeks ask about her. Why does she do this? And they all say, is it Russian disinformation? And frankly, I don't think it is. I am quite sure, and this is actually talking to American reporters who have looked into this, who cover Ukraine and Russia usually, is that they believe that she's most likely met with people who are normal. They could be current members of parliament in Ukraine who come, they say, look, this is why Zelensky is bad, or this is why Yermak is bad, who's the chief of staff of the president, or this is why the other person's bad. And they give her information such as whatever it is, the crap that she's repeating, and she takes it seriously. She doesn't realize, though, she's being manipulated. They might be giving her real files, they might be giving her real information, but the fact is they're using her as a tool to serve somebody else's interest. She might very well think that she's doing something noble. But the fact is they're using her as a proxy to fight wars that are going on now in Kiev, in the parliament, between different factions and different oligarchs.
So we are seeing that this information warfare game is far more complicated. On the one hand, you have Russians who kind of try to strong arm their way into all of this. And yes, they're benefiting from all of this and from their collaboration with these entities, but it's being enhanced by a source of funding that comes from a different source, and that's more credible than going directly to Russia. Nobody wants to say I'm a Russian spy or I'm a Russian agent of influence, but saying, I'm here, I'm with this voice from Ukraine, and as Ukrainians, they have a right to have a different position on this handling of the war, for instance. That makes them, appear legitimate in the eyes of US
Absolutely.
politics.
Absolutely, and it's I think one of the great things of in character assassination. One of the things that you see is the use of entities. They'll have a name, something like the Anti-Disinformation Center, which really just does disinformation. But when they come and they say, "Look, this guy is just lying. That's why we have to close a TV station." Well, that's disinformation, and I'm just making an example, no? Or if it's the League of Democracies Foundation, and it shows up and says, "Look, this guy's anti-democratic for whatever." It sounds legitimate. I mean, it's a League of Democracy, so it must be, tell me what's true. And it's an artificial organization that exists specifically for the purpose of disinformation or to discredit others or to character assassinate others. But that's common. I mean, and I have no doubt that Russia excels in doing that, as do oligarchs.
So interestingly, I think, to the extent everyone is now trying to fight Russian disinformation, they would do well to look at other sources of funding other than just straight Kremlin, which is those Ukrainian oligarchs and probably assorted other proxies and parties from around Eastern Europe, not just those guys. I'm hearing the same type of situation being happening in Bulgaria, for instance, but in Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan, where Russia has a great deal more of control than anyone cares to admit, and which engages in outright disinformation optics by pretending to support Ukraine, but actually on the government level, fully collaborating with Moscow on many issues. But I wanted to get back to the question of character assassination, which has been, despite Zelensky's obvious mistakes in handling certain issues, he has tried to change the course during the war, and he has achieved a great deal of success to the extent it was possible on his end politically in terms of lobbying for Ukraine's interests. Nevertheless, the attacks against him have not only not decreased over time, but as actually Ukraine's role in the media has become less over time, as is natural in the 24/7 infotainment cycle. It seems to me that the attacks on him, this character assassination attempts by his assorted enemies, have become more successful, and they certainly seem to be affecting the popular discourse in the United States a great deal more. Not sure if they have reached the level of Congress quite yet, but the popular discourse, especially with the Republicans, seems to be increasingly more focused on his person. The latest Vogue photo shoot is just one example of that. Can you tell me what is happening, and why has Ukraine not been able to counter these attacks?
So, I think one thing Zelensky has done, I mean, listen, he's done a good job. So I want to start with saying that. So people know my position. I think he's done a good job in light of the war and everything else, which is, not a circumstance you would expect to find yourself in. So he comes to this from a completely non-political background, everything else. That being said, I think one of the things that lends himself to the problems that he encounters today, and I say this as a sincere political analysis of the man's actions, is that he's very big on what his former profession was, which is what is going to trend, what looks good, how does it appear to the public. He's very good about that. He naturally, I mean, that's been his entire career. He became extremely wealthy and successful doing that because he was very successful. I mean, his TV shows were syndicated and sold throughout the former Soviet states. So one thing, and I said a couple examples of that. Sloganeering, which I think has been unhealthy for Ukraine, and I give you two recent examples. One is the close the skies over Ukraine. There was never a chance that they were going to close the skies over Ukraine. That NATO was, at least, that they were going to send airplanes. Now, rather than saying close the skies over Ukraine, if they had said something different, which was we're being attacked, is there a way to stop aerial attack? The West has since then sent things to fight aerial attack. But instead of saying close the skies, which was just not going to happen, the same way as saying we want to join the EU now, and we want to join also the NATO right now, there was never a chance of them joining either one. So it was wasting political capital to do that. And I think that hurt him in the case of the United States, and much more in the case of the European Union. Though in the case of how Ukrainians perceived it, was perceived very, very popularly. Unfortunately, I don't think that was the correct way of understanding how the international audience would see it.
I think there was that mismatch in rhetoric between what he thought would play well here versus how it was actually going to be perceived.
Well, look at how before the war, don't panic. The West, I mean, there was I think it was the front page article, Washington Post, if I recall, or New York Times, that was 4 or 5 days before the invasion, or maybe it's 2 weeks before invasion, I recall, saying tempers steam between the White House and Kiev over, lack of paying attention to what's going on, or lack of receptiveness to what's going on. I can't remember the exact title, but there is clearly a problem. There's clearly a conflict between the two sides. And so I think that, yes, same thing goes with the photo shoot. Obviously, I understand the photo shoot doesn't take that much time. It's not a big deal. That being said, his entire persona of only wearing this green shirt and the khaki pants because we're in war and he has to always be ready for war, it's sort of undercut when you're doing a photo shoot where they're putting on makeup and everything else. And this is why he has to dress in battle fatigues and he can't wear a tie when he's meeting with the head of the European Union, for instance, is because, well, we're in battle. But then he has time for a photo shoot. It doesn't look good. The optics, it's called the optics. Now, and I'm frankly not criticizing. I mean, I understand why he's doing it. It doesn't bother me at all. But I understand how those who are already predisposed to not like him for whatever reason, look at them and say, look, it's just a fake. He's a phony. And they're going to use it against him. So that's something politicians have to be very careful about, because you can easily be spun in a way that you did not intend.
Do you think this also has to do with the fact that that some of the messaging has been a one-size-fits-all pro-democracy, pro-liberalism, anti-corruption messaging aimed at the general US pro-dissident public, failing to take into account the polarization, in domestic polarization in the US and the emergence of different audiences? Do you think Russians are simply better at understanding the current political climate in the US?
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it. Understanding the political climate is a huge factor. And unfortunately, I see that there's a ongoing struggle for Ukraine to understand the political climate. That's a big problem. But also, I think that Russia is not perfect to understand the US political climate, but they have a good sense of it. They have a much better sense than Ukraine does, frankly. And so they do know how to play things differently, how to use things differently. And they're, I think, much more strategic and long-term thinking about how to use things. Less tactical, more strategic. Where Ukraine is much more tactical. And that's why it's sloganeering, for instance. But yeah, that is definitely a factor. You're right.
So we are probably going to see a lot more of character assassination campaigns. Unfortunately, the people who are already predisposed to particular political positions are more likely to buy into those things over time. What can we do here in the US on our end, regardless of what Zelensky himself chooses to do, and which we have no control over, to prevent Russian and oligarch and whatever else pro-aggression interests from making a popular impact? Tucker Carlson is not going away. Nobody is going to investigate him for foreign funding or whatever. Neither is any number of other actors, and politicians are going to say whatever they're going to say. But how do we inform the public better on these issues in the presence of these significant agents of influence?
Well, yeah, it's a really good question, but and I've thought about it a lot. I think one of the things that's important for Ukraine not to get lost in the grand scheme of things, it is a few factors, but one of the most important is to separate Zelensky from Ukraine. And it's fine that he's the center of attention. That's not the problem, and it's not a problem whatsoever. The problem, though, is that imagine over time, for whatever reason, whatever scandals happen in Kiev, whatever happens politically in Kiev, he loses elections. Anything can happen. I don't know what's going to happen. But the thing is that people have to understand that it doesn't depend on him. Ukraine is not Zelensky. Zelensky's Ukraine. He is a politician in Ukraine. Support for Ukraine must be because of a number of principles, because those won't change. Whether it's the fact that sovereignty of the country, whether it's freedom, or these other terms that Americans identify with. This is why we support Ukraine. It's not we support Ukraine because of Zelensky. And I think that's a very dangerous, incorrect, wrong position that some people have taken, not intentionally. I don't think it's their intent, but when they use him as the representative of everything Ukrainian, it's problematic, because one day, for whatever reason, if more people turn against him, that means that people will be turning against Ukraine, and that's the last thing we want to happen.
And I see some of that happening already, but there is the other factor, which is unfortunate misunderstanding and projection of US domestic policies on Ukraine, regardless of Zelensky himself, although it also impacts his image as well, which is Biden's ties to Burisma and Hunter Biden and all of that, and this Russian penetration and oligarch corruption and whatever else is being projected, first of all, in all of Ukraine. And second, people don't understand that the pro-Russian influence that has led to this level of corruption to begin with, and the people who are in office now, however imperfect they may be, are at least somewhat distancing themselves from those positions as opposed to their predecessors and whatever. People tend to not make the distinction between the current office holders and the Biden contacts, and they tend to project this US domestic polarization on the current conflict and identify with Russia against Biden, to put it very, very roughly. So this is a much bigger problem even than Zelensky's personal image, because it does create a problem with the freedom messaging that means few Americans identify even with that messaging. Forget Zelensky for a second, they don't tend to sympathize with Ukraine because they see it as an agent of corruption that hurts US domestically. But that's in the most charitable way of interpreting these sentiments.
You're totally right, Matt. You're 100% right. And once again, so it's an interesting rule of international relations or foreign policy, which I always cite, which is that all international politics is decided by domestic politics. Anything that happens internationally, it's because of domestic demand. And in the case of projectionism, you're absolutely, and as I just said, the Ukrainians use the U.S. Congress for their own political purposes. It's the same way the other way around. It's identical to that the other way around. Is that the Americans say, unfortunately, conservatives or Republicans specifically, where you see the most of this, the ones who are isolationist in nature, the Tucker Carlson crowd, other members of Congress that love him, who think that Ukraine's the cesspool of corruption, and that Russia's this Christian nation that's wonderful and has wonderful values, and which is just false. I mean, it has no basis in science. I mean, it's just insanity. You could look at any polling, you can see what Russians think. It doesn't make sense. Yet they believe that Russia is perhaps a good force in the world. Okay, show me examples of that. It's serious. And it's sad, but unfortunately, I think that they are looking for a way to hate Biden or be against Biden, and whatever Biden does is bad, and that means that the other side's going to be good. And it doesn't necessarily work that way. Sometimes, even a broken clock is right in giving the time. And it's the same time here that, even, if it's Biden, Trump, whoever says it, it will not change my opinion. If they say that Russia is bad, I'll agree with them because they are correct. If they said Putin is a murderer, I'll agree. It's true. I don't have to necessarily always oppose whoever. I mean, you can agree with somebody even if you hate them.
Yeah, this unfortunately part of the polarization and part of the disinformation campaigns is to prevent that level of nuance in discourse from happening, and people do feel emotionally compelled to oppose whatever their guy or the other side is, not using, saying just instinctively and habitually. And the proliferation of assorted domestic scandals having to do with Russia and the Russiagate hoax did not help the matters. The failure to provide any evidence whatsoever, and the whole issue with the Christopher Steele dossier and all of that certainly helped build the basis for this level of skepticism, distrust in U.S. intelligence, distrust in U.S. government, and certainly distrust in the Democrats whenever they are in office. So unfortunately, I don't really see an easy way to overcome it, but it is a factor that is going to affect these international considerations. They're certainly going to affect Ukraine's issue, because Ukraine has to take these considerations into account and find a way to address them. And we certainly for ourselves have to find a way of addressing them, unless we want to be used by countries like Russia or oligarchs because of our own internal vulnerabilities to being manipulated by emotional sentiments.
Absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, as the rule is that 80% of a voter's decision making is based upon emotion. And I think that this, especially something like the modern U.S. politics being as hyper-partisan as it is, lends itself to very irrational decisions, especially on foreign policy, which is a little bit more complex then he's right, he's wrong. This is not choosing a sports team and who's going to win. This is serious stuff. And unfortunately, we treat it a little too lightly, I think, and it's become so partisan that it's ultimately for long-term, I think, disinterest of the United States and long-term harm of the United States, that some politicians take positions that are damnful to us simply so they can hurt the other side. And it's insanity.
Well, thank you so much for your insights and for lending this level of understanding into a very complicated topic. Oh, just one more question before we end. That's been bothering me all along, and I haven't come to any particular conclusions myself, but I'm curious about your analysis, which is the story with the double agent or one, or maybe not double agent, who was killed in a shootout with the SBU, supposedly spying either on behalf of Russia or on behalf of Ukraine, depending on which side you ask.
At the peace talks. So I don't know more than what I've heard. And what I've heard is that they were leaving a meeting, and his cell phone is what gave him away. They noticed his messages that he was communicating with the Russian side, and they apparently just shot him.
Mm-hmm. So essentially, we know at least the answer which side he was working for, which is always good that there is some level of clarity on that.
There's at least clarity on that.
Okay. Well, yeah, we wouldn't want it to turn into another Nasenko scenario which ended up splitting our own intelligence for the last 40 years. Well, thank you so much. This was most enlightening.
Good talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and I'll share the YouTube video for everyone watching. This was the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Dr. Jason J. Smart, and next week we'll be back, usual time, 9 p.m. Tuesday. Stay tuned.